In the sterile quiet of a hospital room, where loneliness hangs heavier than the beeping machines, an unexpected connection begins. Claire Reyes, a dedicated but overworked nurse, stumbles upon a quiet, forgotten patient, Henry Blake, a retired teacher whose life has faded into isolation. What starts as a simple cup of tea and a moment of conversation becomes something far greater. In the room next door, James Whitmore, a wealthy but emotionally distant businessman, overhears Claire's quiet act of kindness. It's a small moment, but it stirs something long buried within him, a longing for purpose, for connection, for redemption. Their lives, three seemingly unrelated paths, intersect in ways none of them could have imagined. As Claire's compassion sets off a ripple effect, Henry's story becomes more than just one man's life. It becomes a spark for change. What happens when one small act of kindness touches the right people? Can a forgotten soul find new hope? Can a businessman rediscover his humanity? And can a nurse who feels invisible realize the power she holds to transform lives? The golden light of the setting sun filtered through the window blinds of room 412 at St. Clair's Hospital. The rays spread across the floor like delicate threads of warmth, but inside the room, the air felt heavy and still. Henry Blake lay propped up against the pillows, his thin frame barely making an imprint on the hospital mattress. At 83, his body had grown frail, and his hair had turned a wispy shade of white, but his eyes still carried the faint glimmer of a life well lived. Today, though, that glimmer was dim, like the last ember in a dying fire. Henry had been in this room for weeks, his presence barely noticed by the endless stream of nurses and doctors who came and went. They were kind, but always hurried, focused on vital signs and IV drips rather than the man who lay before them. He had become just another patient in a bed, another name on a chart. The quiet had grown louder with each passing day. Henry often stared at the ceiling, letting his mind drift to days long gone. He thought of his wife, Margaret, with her laughter like bells and her hands soft as flower petals. She had been gone for 10 years now, leaving a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of time had filled. He thought of his children, both grown and scattered across the country. They called every few weeks out of obligation, their voices filled with hurried affection, but their lives had no room left for him. The hospital room, with its sterile walls and constant beeping, had become a place of waiting. For what? Henry was not sure. Maybe it was for the next meal, the next dose of medicine, or something less tangible, an end to the emptiness. Outside the room, the hallway buzzed with the hum of the evening shift winding down. Claire Reyes, a nurse in her late 20s, stood leaning against the counter, flipping through patient charts. Her eyes burned with exhaustion, and her feet ached from 12 hours of near-constant movement. She wore her scrubs like a uniform of endurance, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Claire loved being a nurse. She always had. The job was not glamorous, and the pay barely stretched far enough to cover her modest studio apartment, her bills, and the groceries she bought with careful budgeting. But nursing made her feel useful. It made her feel like she was giving something of herself to the world. Lately, though, the exhaustion had started to seep deeper than her bones. The hospital was short-staffed, the shifts grew longer, and the patients began to blur together. She missed the days when she had time to sit with people, to listen to their stories, and offer comfort. It was the part of nursing that made it more than just a job. It made it human. Claire glanced down at the chart in her hand. Henry Blake, room 412, condition, stabilized but weak. Something about the name tugged at her heart. She had seen him before, a quiet man who never asked for anything. She imagined his days stretched long and empty. Her feet urged her to keep walking, to sign out for the day and head home to her quiet apartment where leftovers awaited her. But something held her there. Maybe it was the memory of her father in his final months, lying in a similar bed, with no one to keep him company, but the hum of machines. Taking a deep breath, Claire knocked softly on the door to room 412 and pushed it open. The light spilling through the blinds fell across Henry's face as he turned his head, his sunken cheeks catching the glow. For a moment, his expression flickered with surprise. "Good evening, Mr. Blake," Claire said gently, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "Mind if I sit with you for a bit?" Henry blinked at her, as if unsure she was real. "You have had a long day, young lady," he said, his voice soft but steady. "Do not you have better things to do?" Claire gave a small chuckle, settling into the chair. "Not really. Besides, I think everyone deserves a little company now and then." The faintest smile tugged at the corner of Henry's mouth, and for a moment the lines on his face seemed less deep. "Well, I cannot argue with that," he murmured. Claire leaned forward, resting her elbows on the edge of the bed. "Is there anything you would like to talk about? Or I can just sit here while you rest." Henry hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window. Outside, the sun was dipping below the horizon, turning the sky awash of orange and gold. "It has been a while since anyone has asked me that," he said at last. "I used to teach, you know. English literature, 30 years in a classroom." Claire's eyes brightened. "Really? That is incredible. What made you choose teaching?" Henry let out a dry chuckle, the sound like the rustling of leaves. "It was not for the money, I will tell you that much." He paused, his voice growing warmer as he continued. "I loved seeing kids discover books. They would walk into my classroom without knowing who Shakespeare or Steinbeck was, and by the end of the year, they were quoting lines back to me." As Henry spoke, his voice steadied, and the dullness in his eyes began to fade. Claire listened intently, occasionally asking questions that nudged him into sharing more. He told her about the years he had spent coaching the debate team, about the bright students who had gone on to do great things. "You must have been proud of them," Claire said softly. "I was," Henry replied. His expression dimmed slightly. "Margaret, my wife used to say that teaching kept me young. She was my greatest cheerleader." Claire noticed the way his hands tightened slightly on the edge of the blanket. "You must miss her a lot," she said. Henry nodded, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Every day." The room fell quiet for a moment, the only sound the faint beeping of the heart monitor. Claire felt a lump form in her throat. She had known loss too, the kind that lingers like a shadow. She understood the weight of memories that press on your chest when the world grows still. "I am sorry, Mr. Blake," she said softly. Henry turned his gaze back to her, and there was something like gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "But please, call me Henry." "All right, Henry," Claire replied with a small smile. She glanced at the book resting on the bedside table. "Would you like me to read to you? It looks like you have a good one here." Henry looked surprised. "You would do that?" "Of course," Claire said, reaching for the book. "What is life without a good story?" She opened to the first page, her voice calm and clear as she began to read. The words filled the room, weaving through the quiet like threads of gold. Henry closed his eyes not to sleep, but to listen. For the first time in days, the loneliness felt a little less heavy, and the sterile walls of room 412 seemed a little less cold. Outside in the hallway, James Whitmore stood by his mother's room, scrolling through his phone. The sound of Claire's voice carried faintly through the thin hospital walls, its warmth tugging at something deep within him. James paused, looking toward the open door of Henry's room. He lingered for a moment, his curiosity piqued. He had come to the hospital out of obligation, not affection. But something about the scene he glimpsed a nurse reading to a tired old man made him pause. It was not something he was used to seeing. Later, as Claire walked home under the fading light of the evening, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle in her chest. It was not much, just a few words, a little time, but for Henry, she hoped it had been enough to make a difference. Little did she know, Her simple act of kindness had set something in motion, something that would change not just Henry's life, but her own. The evening light had disappeared entirely, leaving room 412 cloaked in darkness except for the faint blue glow from the monitors. Henry Blake slept soundly for the first time in days. The comfort of Claire's presence lingered long after she had left, like the fading warmth of sunlight on an autumn afternoon. Outside the hospital, Claire Reyes walked through the quiet streets toward her apartment, her bag slung over one shoulder. The evening air was cool, and the world felt muted. She lived in a small one-room studio in a neighborhood where the buildings seemed to lean tiredly against one another. The apartment was clean but sparse. A worn couch sat against one wall, and a small table balanced stacks of patient notes and unopened bills. Claire set her bag down and sighed, kicking off her shoes. The day's exhaustion hit her like a wave, but there was something else, a lingering feeling that she could not quite name. She thought about Henry's voice as he spoke about his wife, about the way his eyes lit up when he talked about his day's teaching. Margaret used to say teaching kept me young. Claire leaned back on the couch and stared at the ceiling, her thoughts drifting. There had been something so familiar in Henry's quiet grief. It reminded her of her father. He had been a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, building sturdy furniture that would outlast him. In his final months, he had grown frail and quiet, much like Henry. Claire still remembered the ache of leaving him alone at the hospice because her job demanded long hours. She had sat by his bedside whenever she could, but it never felt like enough. She closed her eyes. "You cannot save everyone, Claire," she murmured, echoing the words of a senior nurse who often lectured her about boundaries. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew it was not true. People like Henry alone, forgotten, needed someone to show them that they still mattered. The next evening, Claire stood in her small kitchen, spooning banana bread batter into a pan. Her movements were quick but deliberate, her brow furrowed as she thought about what she was doing. She did not have much to give. Her paycheck barely covered the basics, but she knew how to bake, and she knew how to listen. Sometimes, she thought, the smallest things made the biggest difference. As the bread baked, the warm, sweet smell filled the tiny apartment. Claire poured chamomile tea into a thermos, a simple remedy her mother used to make whenever someone was under the weather. When the bread was done and cooled, Claire sliced a generous piece, placing it in a small plastic container. She slipped everything into a paper bag, hesitating for just a moment. "Is this silly?" she wondered aloud. But the image of Henry sitting alone in that cold, sterile room flashed in her mind, and her resolve strengthened. The hospital was busier than usual when Claire arrived. The evening shift buzzed with nurses finishing their rounds and janitors beginning their work. Claire waved shyly at the receptionist, who raised an eyebrow. "You are not scheduled tonight," the woman said, curiosity in her tone. "Just visiting," Claire replied with a small smile, holding up the paper bag. By the time she reached room 412, the sky outside was painted in hues of deep purple and orange. She knocked lightly before pushing the door open. Henry turned his head slowly, his eyes widening in surprise when he saw her. The edges of his mouth curled up, soft but unmistakable. "Back again, Nurse Reyes?" he said, a hint of humor in his voice. Claire grinned. "Just Claire today," she replied, stepping inside. She held up the bag. "I brought you something. I thought you might like some tea. The hospital stuff is not exactly gourmet." Henry chuckled, the sound faint but genuine. "Well, aren't I spoiled?" Claire moved closer, pulling a small table across the bed so she could set the items down. She poured the steaming tea into a cup and handed it to Henry. His hands, though unsteady, cradled the cup like a treasure. He inhaled deeply, his expression softening. "Chamomile," he murmured. "My Margaret used to drink this every evening." Claire smiled. "My mom made it for me whenever I was feeling sick. It's simple, but it helps." Henry took a sip, his eyes closing for a moment in appreciation. "You are full of surprises, Claire," he said, setting the cup down. Claire opened the container and revealed the slice of banana bread, cut into small, manageable pieces. "I made this last night. I am not much of a baker, but I think it turned out okay." Henry picked up a piece, studying it as if it were a rare gem. He took a careful bite, and his eyes closed again, this time in pleasure. "This is wonderful," he said, his voice soft with amazement. "You did not have to go to all this trouble." Claire shrugged lightly. "It's no trouble. I just figured you might need a little extra care." For a long moment, Henry said nothing. He simply looked at her with an expression Claire could not quite place. It was something between gratitude and disbelief, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. "Thank you, Claire," he said finally. His voice trembled slightly. "You are very kind." Claire smiled and pulled the chair close to his bed. "So, tell me more about those books you love. I want to know which one is your favorite." The question brought life back to Henry's face. The lines of weariness seemed to soften as he launched into stories about of mice and men and To Kill a Mockingbird. His voice grew stronger with each word, like a man rediscovering his love for something long forgotten. Claire listened intently, occasionally asking questions that prompted him to share more. As the conversation stretched on, Henry's words slowed, and he yawned, the fatigue finally catching up to him. Claire gathered the empty cup and container, tucking them neatly back into the bag. "Rest up, Henry," she said gently. "I will check on you tomorrow." Henry smiled at her, his eyelids heavy. "You know," he murmured, his voice faint, "you remind me of my Margaret. She always had a way of making people feel seen." Claire felt her throat tighten, but she smiled. "That is a wonderful compliment. I'll see you tomorrow, Henry." Outside room 412, Claire nearly bumped into a tall man standing near the doorway. Startled, she stepped back. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly. The man looked up from his phone. He wore a tailored suit, his hair neatly styled, but his expression was soft, almost apologetic. "No, it's my fault," he replied. It was James Whitmore. He had been visiting his mother in the adjacent room, but something had drawn him to linger outside Henry's door. He had seen Claire sitting by the old man's bedside, heard the quiet hum of their conversation, and the faint sound of laughter. He had watched, unnoticed, as she offered Henry the tea and bread with a patience and tenderness he had not seen in years. "You seem to care a great deal about your patients," James said finally, his voice sincere. Claire blushed slightly, shrugging her shoulders. "It's part of the job. Everyone deserves to feel cared for, especially when they're sick or alone." James studied her for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "Not everyone would go above and beyond like you did," he said softly. Claire tilted her head, unsure of how to respond. "Sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference," she said after a pause. James nodded slowly, as though her words carried more weight than she realized. "You are absolutely right," he murmured. That night, as Claire walked home beneath the starless sky, she thought of Henry's smile, of the sound of his voice as he shared his stories. For the first time in weeks, she felt that her exhaustion was worth it. She had made a difference, however small, and that was enough. What Claire did not know was that her simple act of kindness had been seen, and it had begun to stir something in the heart of a man who had the means to change far more than just one life. The next morning, the faint hum of hospital life buzzed through St. Clair's walls. Heels clicking down corridors, the soft murmurs of conversations, and the rhythmic beep of machines echoing in the background. Room 412 sat quiet in the early light of day, its occupant stirring softly against his pillow. Henry Blake felt more rested than he had in months. The tea, the banana bread, and most of all, Claire's warm presence had left an imprint, soothing a loneliness he had carried for far too long. It was strange how much difference a single visit had made. For the first time in weeks, Henry had not felt like just another body hooked up to wires and drips. "Small things," he whispered to himself, repeating Claire's words from the night before. His voice cracked, but the smile that touched his lips was real. Down the hall, Claire Reyes scanned a monitor near the nurse's station, checking vitals and charting patient updates for the day. The hospital was alive with its usual chaos calls over the intercom, the whirring of rolling carts, and tired nurses trading weary smiles. Claire worked efficiently, her mind focused on her tasks, but the memory of Henry's soft laughter lingered. She looked at the clock. It was 9:30 a.m., still early enough to peek into room 412 for a quick check-in before her rounds intensified. As she approached Henry's door, she caught a glimpse of a tall figure standing just outside, peering into the room with a curious, almost conflicted expression. It was the same man she had nearly bumped into last night, James Whitmore. Claire slowed her pace, instinctively studying him. He was sharply dressed, his navy suit pressed perfectly, his leather shoes polished to a mirror shine. But something about him did not quite match the image of a businessman at ease. His posture was tense, his hands shoved into his pockets, and his brow furrowed slightly, as though he were unsure what to do next. Claire stopped beside him. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitmore, right?" she said, her voice soft but polite. James straightened, caught off guard. "Yes, He cleared his throat, glancing back into Henry's room before turning to her. "Sorry, I did not mean to hover. I was just curious." Claire tilted her head slightly. "Curious?" James hesitated, his gaze shifting back to the door. "I overheard you last night. You were with Mr. Blake, reading to him, sharing tea. It was—" He trailed off for a moment, as if searching for the right word. "It was kind." Claire blinked, surprised. "Oh, thank you." She glanced toward the open door, where Henry was now looking toward them, clearly listening. "It's not much, really. Mr. Blake has been alone for a while. Sometimes company helps more than medicine does." James nodded slowly, as though her words had confirmed something for him. He looked past Claire into the room again. "I have been visiting my mother down the hall," he explained quietly. "But last night, seeing you with Mr. Blake, it reminded me of something I had forgotten." Claire studied him, her curiosity growing. There was a faint weariness behind his polished exterior, as if his neatly constructed life had cracks just beneath the surface. "And what is that?" she asked softly. James hesitated, then met her gaze. "That everyone needs someone." Claire nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I think that is true." The conversation might have ended there, but Henry's voice called out from inside the room. "Well, do not stand in the doorway whispering like conspirators. Come in, both of you." James looked startled, and Claire could not help but smile. "Looks like you have been invited," she said, gesturing for him to follow. Inside the room, Henry was sitting up, his frail hands adjusting the blanket across his lap. "Good morning, Claire," he said warmly, his gaze flicking toward James with curiosity. "And who is your friend here?" "This is Mr. Whitmore," Claire introduced, pulling up her usual chair. "He is visiting his mother, but I guess we got his attention." James stepped forward, hesitant, but he extended his hand to Henry. "James Whitmore," he said. "It is nice to meet you, Mr. Blake." Henry shook his hand weakly but firmly. "Henry," he replied, "I have to admit, you don't look like the kind of man who wanders hospital halls for fun." James smiled faintly and pulled up a chair, sitting on the other side of the bed. "I suppose I do not," he admitted. "I run a business, Mr. Blake. Most of my time is spent in meetings or offices. But last night, I heard Claire reading to you, and it made me think." Henry raised an eyebrow, his voice carrying a teasing edge. "Think about what, exactly?" James shifted uncomfortably, his polished confidence faltering just a little. "About how long it has been since I truly talked to someone," he said honestly. "I visit my mother because I should, not because I want to. And sitting there last night, Scrolling through my phone, I realized how much I have missed. Henry nodded slowly, his expression softening. Loneliness does not just happen to people like me, he said quietly. It happens to everyone, even the busy ones. The words struck James more deeply than he expected. He cleared his throat, looking down at his hands. That is true, he murmured. I think I have let work take over my life. Claire watched the exchange with quiet fascination. She had not expected James to open up, least of all to a man like Henry. But there was something in Henry's gentle wisdom, an ability to see people for who they were that broke down barriers without effort. Well, Henry said after a moment, breaking the silence, it's never too late to change course, Mr. Whitmore. I spent years teaching kids that they could rewrite their own stories. Adults can do the same, you know. James looked up, something like surprise flashing across his face. Rewrite their stories? Henry smiled faintly, leaning back against the pillows. That's what books are all about, isn't it? Redemption, second chances, new beginnings. Life can be like that too, if you let it. The words hung in the air for a moment before James finally smiled a real smile, not the polite one he wore in boardrooms. You sound like my old literature teacher. Henry chuckled softly. I will take that as a compliment. Claire stayed with Henry for a while longer, ensuring he was comfortable before she left to finish her rounds. James lingered behind, clearly reluctant to leave the room. Henry's words had stayed with him, unraveling thoughts he had buried for years. As Claire walked back through the hallway, she felt something shift inside her. She had seen it how kindness, even in its smallest form, could ripple outward. Henry's simple wisdom had cracked through James's polished exterior, even if just a little. Later that evening, James sat beside his mother in her room, the sterile walls feeling less cold than usual. For the first time in years, he talked to her not about doctors or medications, but about memories from his childhood. He asked her questions, small ones at first, but enough to spark a smile on her tired face. And across the hall, Henry lay in room 412, his head resting against the pillow. He thought of Claire and her tea, of the young businessman who had sat by his bed, unsure of himself, but willing to listen. Small things, Henry whispered again, his eyes closing. For the first time in weeks, he did not feel forgotten. That night, as Claire walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her. She thought about Henry's words about stories being rewritten, and for the first time, she wondered if her own story might be changing too. Little did she know, those ripples were only just beginning to spread. The early morning light filtered through the hospital windows, casting soft patterns on the tiled floor. St. Clair's Hospital was already in motion, nurses moving briskly from room to room, doctors huddled together at stations discussing rounds, and patients slowly waking to another day in their small, sterile rooms. Claire Reyes stood in front of room 412, her hand lingering on the door handle for just a moment before she pushed it open. Henry Blake was awake, his back propped against the pillows as he quietly stared out the window. The sunlight fell across his face, accentuating the deep lines etched into his skin, a map of a long life, filled with joys and hardships. "Good morning, Henry," Claire said softly as she stepped inside. Henry turned his head, a faint smile lifting his lips. "Claire," he greeted, his voice still gravelly from sleep. "Back again so soon?" Claire chuckled as she checked the monitors by his bed. "You act like I do not work here." Henry's smile widened just a little. "It feels like more than just work to you, though. That is what makes the difference." Claire paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. It was a simple observation, but one that struck her deeply. She nodded. "I guess I try to treat people the way I would want to be treated. Sometimes all we need is for someone to care." Henry watched her as she moved about the room, tidying things up and making notes on his chart. "You remind me of Margaret, you know," he said suddenly. "She had that same determination. always finding ways to do more with what little she had. Claire smiled softly, pulling a chair beside his bed. She sounds like she was a wonderful woman. Henry's gaze drifted to the window again. She made everything brighter. He paused, his voice quieting. I was lucky to have her for as long as I did. But now, he trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Claire could feel the weight in his words, the lingering loneliness that stretched beyond his time in the hospital. She hesitated before asking gently, Henry, have you thought about what happens when you leave here? Will someone be able to help you? Henry sighed, his thin shoulders sinking a little deeper into the pillows. No one's left to help, he admitted quietly. My children, they have their own lives now. We talk on the phone sometimes, but they live across the country. It's easier for them this way. Claire's heart clenched as she watched him. She had heard similar stories from other patients before, but hearing it from Henry, this kind man who had spent his life giving to others, was different. You should not have to go through this alone, Henry, she said softly. Henry offered a small smile, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Don't worry about me, Claire. I have managed on my own for a long time now. But Claire did worry. As she sat with him, listening to the beeping monitors and the distant hum of the hospital, her mind raced. Where would Henry go? Who would make sure he was safe, fed, and cared for? The thought of him struggling alone in some empty house weighed on her. Sometimes, Henry continued, his voice breaking her thoughts, loneliness becomes something you just learn to live with. You stop expecting anything else. Claire swallowed hard. It doesn't have to be that way, Henry, she said gently, her voice steady but filled with emotion. There's always someone who can help. Always. Henry looked at her, his expression softening. You are a good soul, Claire. The world could use more people like you. Claire smiled faintly, but said nothing. As much as she wanted to reassure him, the truth gnawed at her. Henry's quiet resignation reminded her of her father's final days, how he had insisted he would manage alone, refusing to be a burden. She had done what she could for him back then, but the guilt of not doing enough still lingered. As she stood to leave, Henry reached for her hand, his frail fingers curling around hers. Thank you, Claire, he murmured, for everything. Claire squeezed his hand gently. I'll check in on you later, Henry. The rest of the day passed in a blur of charts, rounds, and hurried conversations with other nurses. Claire moved efficiently from room to room, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Henry. She could not shake the image of him sitting alone in an empty house, with no one to bring him tea or listen to his stories about teaching. By late afternoon, Claire found herself in the break room, staring into a lukewarm cup of coffee. The exhaustion of the day clung to her, but it was the feeling of helplessness that wore her down the most. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small white card that had been tucked away since the evening James Whitmore had handed it to her. His name and number were printed in sleek, black font. Claire stared at it for a long moment, her fingers running along its edges. What would I even say? She muttered aloud. I barely know him. But she did know one thing. James Whitmore had resources and influence, two things Claire did not have. If anyone could help Henry, it might be him. Her heart pounded as she pulled out her phone. She hesitated, staring at the screen. Was this foolish? Would he think she was overstepping? But then she remembered the look on Henry's face that morning, the quiet acceptance of his loneliness, and she knew she could not ignore it. Taking a deep breath, Claire dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. James Whitmore speaking. Mr. Whitmore, it's Claire Reyes, she said quickly, her voice slightly shaky. The nurse you spoke to the other day. There was a pause on the other end, and then James's tone warmed. Claire, I'm glad to hear from you. Is everything all right? Claire hesitated before launching into an explanation. She told him about Henry, his life as a teacher, his loneliness, and her fear that he would fall through the cracks when discharged. "I don't know if there's anything you can do," she finished, her voice quieter now. "But I thought it was worth asking." The line was silent for a moment, and Claire worried she had overstepped. But when James finally spoke, his voice was steady and certain. "Leave it to me, Claire," he said. "I'll see what I can do." Claire's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I didn't know who else to ask." "You were right to call," James replied. "I'll be in touch soon." As Claire hung up the phone, a mix of hope and uncertainty swirled inside her. She had no idea what James could do, or if Henry would even accept help, but at least she had tried. For the first time all day, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. That evening, James sat in his study, staring at the neat stack of paperwork on his desk. Henry's story, as told by Claire, echoed in his mind. James could not shake the image of the older man sitting alone in a house too quiet for one person. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. As the CEO of a company with countless connections, James had always considered his network to be one of his greatest assets. For years, it had been a tool to build wealth, expand markets, and secure deals. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, he realized those same connections could be used for something more, something good. Taking a deep breath, James began to make calls. Back in room 412, Henry lay in bed, his eyes drifting closed as the hum of the monitors lulled him into sleep. He thought of Claire, her kindness, her persistence, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder if perhaps life had one more chapter left for him after all. Claire Reyes arrived at the hospital the following morning, coffee in hand and an uneasy mix of hope and doubt tugging at her thoughts. Her phone had remained silent overnight, and though she told herself not to expect miracles, part of her still hoped James Whitmore could help. She knew he had resources far beyond anything she could offer, but it was hard to imagine a man like him taking interest in someone like Henry. As she entered the nurse's station, the bustling energy of the hospital surrounded her. Morning rounds had begun, and clipboards shuffled noisily from one hand to the next. Claire greeted a few co-workers as she scanned the charts on her desk, but her mind kept wandering back to room 412. When she finally reached Henry's door, she paused, as she always did, to collect herself. Claire had learned early in her nursing career that it was important to leave everything else outside the room: personal worries, exhaustion, or stress. Patients deserved her full attention, her full care. She knocked softly before pushing the door open. "Good morning, Henry," she said, her tone light but warm. Henry looked up from where he sat, propped against the pillows. His skin seemed a little brighter today, his eyes more awake. "Morning, Claire," he replied, his voice steadier than usual. "I was wondering when you'd wander back in." Claire smiled as she moved to check his IV and the machines by his bed. "I would not want you thinking I forgot about you." "You forget?" Henry chuckled faintly. "Not likely." Once she had finished her quick check, Claire sat down in the chair beside him. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better," Henry admitted, though his tone was subdued. "A bit stronger, I think. It is funny how a little company can help." Claire's heart swelled, but she kept her voice casual. "That is what I am here for, Henry." Henry looked at her with soft eyes, as though he wanted to say more. He hesitated, then changed the subject. "So what is on the agenda today? Are you going to read to me again?" Claire smiled faintly, remembering the way her reading had seemed to ease his mind the night before. "Maybe later. First you have to eat breakfast. That's the deal." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "You are as bossy as my wife was." Later that morning, Claire stood at the nurse's station, scrolling through patient updates on her tablet, when her phone buzzed in her pocket. She frowned, pulling it out to check the screen. It was a number she did not recognize, but something told her to answer. "Hello?" she said hesitantly. "Claire, It's James Whitmore. Her breath caught slightly, and she straightened instinctively. Mr. Whitmore, she replied. Good morning. Good morning, James said, his voice calm and composed as always. I wanted to let you know that I've spoken to a few people since we last talked. Claire blinked, caught off guard. You did? I have, James continued. There is a small senior care facility a few miles outside the city. It's well-staffed, comfortable, and quiet. They have a space available, and I've arranged for Mr. Blake to stay there if he is willing. I have already spoken to the director to cover the costs. For a moment, Claire could not respond. She stared blankly at the tablet in her hand, trying to process what James had just said. You wait what? James's voice softened slightly, as though he could hear the disbelief in her tone. I know this is sudden, Claire, but I want to help. You were right. Henry shouldn't have to go through this alone. Claire finally found her voice, though it was quiet. I do not know what to say. I didn't think… She trailed off, shaking her head. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I don't know how to thank you for this. There is no need to thank me, James replied. I should be thanking you. You were the one who cared enough to ask. Claire smiled faintly, her throat tightening. I need to talk to Henry about this first, of course, she said, regaining her composure. Of course, James replied. Take your time. Let me know if there's anything else you need. As Claire hung up, she stood frozen for a moment, still holding the phone against her chest. It felt unreal, like something out of a dream. After all her quiet worries about Henry's future, James had come through, not just with words, but with action. Claire entered room 412 a short while later, her heart racing as she rehearsed what she was going to say. Henry looked up at her curiously, clearly noticing something in her expression. What is it, Claire? He asked, his voice both cautious and amused. You look like you're about to give me bad news. Claire shook her head quickly. No, it is good news, I promise. She pulled the chair close to his bedside and sat down, folding her hands together to steady herself. Henry, I talked to someone about you. A man named James Whitmore. He is a businessman who has been visiting his mother here. Henry frowned slightly, looking skeptical. What did you talk to him about? Claire took a deep breath. I told him I was worried about you. I know you say you will manage on your own, but I don't think anyone should have to do that, especially not someone like you. So I asked him if there was anything he could do to help. Henry stared at her, silent. And? He prompted. And he did help, Claire said, her voice soft but steady. He found a small senior care facility nearby. It's quiet and comfortable, and there are people there who will make sure you have everything you need. He has already arranged for a place there for as long as you need it. Henry's brow furrowed deeply, his hands tightening around the edge of the blanket. He seemed to be processing her words, unsure how to respond. I don't understand, he said after a moment. Why would this stranger, do something like that for me? Claire hesitated. I think he was moved by your story, Henry. He overheard us talking, and it reminded him of something he has been missing in his own life. I guess your kindness touched him in a way he wasn't expecting. Henry looked down at his hands, his expression unreadable. And what about you? He asked softly. Why would you do this for me, Claire? Claire swallowed, her throat tight. Because you deserve it, Henry, she said simply. Because no one should feel forgotten. And because maybe I couldn't do enough for my own father when he needed me most. But I can do something now. Henry's face softened, and his eyes glistened as he looked back at her. For a long moment, he said nothing. Finally, he let out a slow breath. I don't know what to say. You do not have to say anything, Claire replied. Just think about it, okay? You don't have to decide right now. Henry nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the window. You're a stubborn one, Claire, he murmured, though his voice was filled with affection. I suppose I will think about it. That evening, as Claire walked home through the dusky streets, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her step. It had been a long day, but her heart felt full in a way it had not in years. She had given Henry something precious hope, and that was worth more than all the exhaustion in the world. At his desk in his sprawling office, James Whitmore sat back in his chair, staring at the city skyline through the large windows. He thought of Claire's quiet determination and Henry's resilience, and he realized that for the first time in a long time, he felt as though he had done something that truly mattered. And in room 412, as the night fell softly over the hospital, Henry lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The thought of leaving the quiet comfort of the life he knew was daunting, but for the first time in years, the future did not feel quite so empty. The sun sat low in the sky the next afternoon, painting the walls of room 412 in soft golden hues. Henry Blake sat upright in his hospital bed, staring at the pale blue slippers on his feet, as though they held the answers to the questions swirling in his mind. For years, his life had been marked by a slow, predictable rhythm. The days bled into one another, quiet mornings, long afternoons, and evenings filled only with memories of what once was. It was a lonely, familiar silence he had learned to endure. But now, everything felt different. Claire's words from the day before echoed in his head. No one should feel forgotten. Henry had spent years convincing himself that loneliness was simply the price of outliving everyone he had loved. Yet here she was, a nurse who barely knew him, caring enough to ask for help, caring enough to insist that his life still mattered. The idea of leaving the hospital, of living somewhere new, felt as impossible as it did hopeful. A senior care facility, Claire had said. Those words carried weight, pulling Henry back to the many conversations he'd had with his children, their voices thin with excuses. "Dad, we wish we could do more, but things are just too busy." Over time, he had stopped asking. A soft knock at the door pulled Henry from his thoughts. "Good afternoon, Henry," Claire said warmly as she entered, carrying her tablet in one hand and a small thermos in the other. She smiled as she moved toward his bed. "I brought tea. Thought you might need some extra courage for today." Henry let out a quiet chuckle, though his eyes were still distant. "You seem awfully sure I've decided." Claire sat in the chair beside him and poured the steaming chamomile tea into a small hospital cup. "I'm hopeful," she said simply, "but it's your decision, Henry. I'll support whatever you choose." He looked at her for a moment, his hands resting heavily on the blanket. "It's been a long time since anyone's given me a choice." Claire placed the cup of tea in his hands, her voice gentle but firm. "You deserve this, Henry. It's a chance to be somewhere peaceful, surrounded by people who can help you, people who care." Henry stared into the cup for a long while, watching the steam rise like mist. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "I don't know if I can start over," he admitted. "Starting over means leaving behind what little I still have." Claire leaned forward, her tone steady. "I know it's scary, but starting over doesn't mean forgetting. You'll still carry Margaret with you. You'll still carry your years of teaching and every story you've shared. This is just a new chapter, Henry, not the end of the book." Her words hung in the air, filling the small room with an unexpected sense of calm. Henry turned his head to look out the window, where the faint outlines of trees swayed gently in the breeze. He imagined a place where he could sit outside with a book, the sun warming his face. A place where laughter didn't feel like a distant memory. "You make it sound so simple," he murmured. Claire smiled softly. "It's not simple. It's just worth it." Henry nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the window. "All right, Claire," he said at last, his voice steady but quiet. "I'll give it a try." The next morning, Claire arrived at work early, a flutter of nervous excitement in her chest. James Whitmore had called late the previous evening to confirm everything. Henry's room at the senior care facility was ready. A cozy space with a view of a garden, access to a small library, and a staff who would ensure he had everything he needed. Claire could hardly wait to tell Henry, though a part of her still worried. Change was never easy, especially for someone like Henry, who had spent so long carrying the weight of solitude. When she entered room 412, Henry was already dressed in a pair of neatly folded clothes, soft button-up shirt, and khaki trousers that Claire had laid out for him earlier. His pale blue slippers were still on his feet, but now they looked like they belonged to someone who was going somewhere. "Morning, Henry," Claire said brightly as she stepped inside. "You look ready for a big day." Henry gave her a small, wry smile. "Well, I figured I shouldn't be late to my own second chance." Claire grinned as she moved to help him into his wheelchair. "You'll fit right in there. I've heard they have a library stocked with classics. You'll be giving lectures in no time." Henry chuckled under his breath, but Claire noticed how tightly his hands gripped the armrests. She squeezed his shoulder gently. "It's going to be okay, Henry," she said softly. He looked up at her, his expression softening. "I know, Claire, it's just a lot." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "One step at a time." The ride to the senior care facility was quiet but comfortable. Claire sat beside Henry in the transport van, pointing out little things through the window, the park where she sometimes walked after work, the bakery she swore had the best chocolate chip cookies in town. Henry listened, nodding occasionally, though his gaze remained fixed on the passing scenery. When they finally pulled up to the facility, Claire could see the garden first, a sprawling space filled with bright flowers, shaded benches, and a few winding pathways. The building itself was smaller than the hospital, but inviting, with large windows and soft beige walls. Henry looked at the garden as they wheeled him inside, his expression unreadable. The director of the facility, a woman named Mrs. Turner, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Blake, welcome," she said, her voice kind but professional. "We've prepared a room for you, and we'll make sure you're comfortable here." Claire stayed close to Henry as they moved through the hallways, helping him settle into his new room. It was simple but cozy. A single bed with a soft quilt, a small wooden bookshelf, and a window overlooking the garden below. Sunlight poured in, filling the space with a quiet warmth. Henry sat in his wheelchair, staring out the window for a long while. Claire stood beside him, unsure whether to say anything. Finally, he spoke. "It's nice," he said quietly. "Quieter than I expected." Claire smiled. "That's a good thing, right?" Henry nodded faintly. "Yes, it is." Claire moved to the bookshelf, scanning the spines of the few books already there. She pulled one out of Mice and Men. "Look at this," she said brightly. "A familiar friend." Henry turned to look, and for the first time that day, his face lit up. "Steinbeck," he murmured. "I haven't read that one in years." Claire walked over and placed the book on the small table beside his bed. "Now you've got no excuse," she teased gently. Henry smiled, the lines on his face softening as he looked at her. "You've done a lot for me, Claire," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope you know that." Claire shook her head, her own throat tightening. "You've done just as much for me, Henry. I mean that." As the afternoon sun dipped lower, Claire reluctantly prepared to leave. Henry sat by the window. The book opens on his lap, sunlight spilling across his hands. "I'll check in on you soon, okay?" Claire said softly as she gathered her things. Henry looked up, his smile small but genuine. "I'll hold you to that." That evening, as Claire walked back to her apartment, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest. She knew Henry would need time to adjust, but for the first time in weeks, she did not feel like she was leaving him behind. He was not alone anymore. And across the city, in his spacious home office, James Whitmore sat at his desk, reading an email from Mrs. Turner about Henry's arrival. A small sense of satisfaction settled over him. For years he had measured success in numbers and deals, but today felt different. Today, he had done something that truly mattered. Back at the senior care facility, Henry Blake sat in his quiet room, the soft hum of evening settling over him. He opened Of Mice and Men, his hand steady as he turned the first page. For the first time in a long time, the future did not feel so empty. The days that followed brought a slow but noticeable shift in Henry Blake's life. At the senior care facility, the hours no longer felt as hollow as they once had. There were quiet routines now, breakfasts in the common dining room, afternoons spent reading in the small but well-loved library, and evenings watching the sunset from a bench in the garden. Henry had always loved books, but now they felt like old friends keeping him company through the changing seasons of his life. In those moments, he often thought about Claire Reyes. He remembered her persistence, her tea and banana bread, and the way she had sat by his hospital bed listening to stories no one else had cared to hear. She had given him more than kindness, she had given him a chance to see what was left of the world, a chance to feel something again. Sitting in the library one afternoon, Henry ran his frail fingers across the spine of To Kill a Mockingbird and smiled faintly. I spent years teaching these words, he thought. Now I get to live with them again. The facility was calm, but it was not lonely. The other residents were polite, some talkative, others as reserved as Henry himself. A few had families who visited, bringing children and flowers, their laughter filling the hallways like sunlight. Henry didn't mind sitting quietly and observing, content to let the noise settle into the background. One day, as he walked slowly through the garden with the help of a cane, he paused beside a bench where two women were chatting. One of them, Mrs. Turner, the facility director, smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Blake," she said. "How are you enjoying your walk today?" Henry leaned on his cane, looking at the blossoms spilling over the garden's edge. "The roses look better than I do," he quipped softly, earning a small laugh from the women. "Mr. Blake," Mrs. Turner continued, her voice more serious now, "I wanted to let you know that someone has been calling to check on you regularly. Miss Claire Reyes, from the hospital. She wanted to make sure you were settling in well." Henry blinked, his face softening with surprise. "Claire?" "Yes," Mrs. Turner said with a nod. "She's been asking about you every few days. It seems you made quite the impression on her." Henry felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "She's a good person," he murmured. "The kind the world doesn't make enough of anymore." Mrs. Turner smiled. "You're right about that." Henry turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip, its light spilling golden across the grass. He stood quietly for a moment, breathing in the scent of the garden. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged to something again, like he mattered to someone beyond the pages of his old stories. Back at St. Clair's Hospital, Claire Reyes was finishing her shift, exhaustion pulling at her shoulders as she scribbled notes into a patient's chart. The day had been relentless, an overflow of patients, broken machines, and hours spent on her feet. But even as the hospital buzzed with its usual chaos, her thoughts drifted toward Henry. She smiled to herself, thinking of him sitting in his new room, likely surrounded by books or wandering the garden with his quiet, reflective presence. The senior care facility had called earlier that day to let her know that Henry was adjusting well, and it had been the best news she had heard in weeks. "You're thinking about that Mr. Blake again, aren't you?" Claire looked up, startled, to see Karen, a fellow nurse, and one of her closest friends, grinning knowingly from across the nurses' station. "I am not," Claire protested lightly, though the blush creeping up her cheeks betrayed her. Karen raised an eyebrow as she sorted through charts. "You are such a terrible liar, Claire. You're checking on him every other day." Claire shrugged, turning back to her notes. "He deserves it. I just want to make sure he's okay." Karen's teasing softened, and her voice grew more thoughtful. "You really care about your patients? More than most people do." Claire glanced up, meeting Karen's gaze. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? Care? Karen smiled faintly, shaking her head. Not everyone goes the extra mile, Claire. You do. Claire didn't know how to respond, so she just smiled and turned back to her work. That evening, as Claire walked home through the quiet streets, her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. Pulling it out, she saw an unexpected name on the screen, James Whitmore. She hesitated before answering. "Hello, Mr. Whitmore," she said, a little out of breath from the cold air. "Claire, good evening," James's calm, steady voice replied. "I just spoke with the director of the senior care facility. Henry's doing well, I'm told." Claire's smile widened, relief washing over her. "That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that." James paused on the other end, as though choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to thank you, Claire. You gave me a reason to do something meaningful for once. It's not something I've been particularly good at." Claire frowned slightly. "You're the one who helped, Mr. Whitmore. You're the reason Henry's there now." "Maybe," James said thoughtfully. "But you're the one who saw him. Really saw him. I'm starting to realize how much that matters." Claire's steps slowed as she listened, the sincerity in James's tone surprising her. For someone whose world was built on numbers and influence, he seemed changed. She imagined him sitting in an office somewhere, surrounded by wealth and power, but feeling somehow small in the middle of it all. "Well," Claire said softly, "sometimes it doesn't take much. Just a little kindness." There was another pause before James spoke again. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about kindness and what more I could do." Claire furrowed her brow, curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I'd rather talk about it in person," James said. "Would you mind meeting me for coffee sometime soon? I have an idea I'd like to run by you." Claire hesitated, caught off guard. She wasn't used to someone like James Whitmore asking for her opinion. But his tone was genuine, and curiosity tugged at her. "Sure," she said finally. "I can do that." "Great," James replied. "I'll give you the details soon. And Claire, thank you for everything." As the call ended, Claire tucked her phone back into her coat pocket and continued walking. The city lights reflected faintly off the pavement, and for the first time in a long time, Claire felt something shift in the air around her. Her mind drifted back to Henry, his quiet resilience, the way he had accepted a chance for something better. And now James, who seemed to be wrestling with his own search for meaning. "Kindness really does ripple out," Claire murmured to herself, smiling faintly as she turned the corner toward her small apartment. Back at the senior care facility, Henry sat by his window, the book opens in his lap but forgotten for the moment. He watched the sun dip below the horizon, its golden light turning the world soft and quiet. "Maybe there's still more to come," he whispered. And for the first time in years, he believed it. The coffee shop sat nestled on the corner of a quiet street, its large windows glowing warmly against the chilly afternoon air. Inside, the hum of conversation blended with the soft clinking of spoons against ceramic mugs. Claire Reyes pushed the door open, the bell above it jingling faintly. The smell of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around her like a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. James Whitmore was already there, seated at a table near the window. His suit jacket was draped neatly over the chair beside him, and his shirt sleeves were rolled up to his elbows. It was the first time Claire had seen him look anything less than perfectly polished, and it surprised her. He looked less like the distant businessman she had imagined, and more like someone real. James looked up as she approached, standing quickly to greet her. "Claire," he said with a genuine smile, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Claire shook his hand lightly before sitting across from him. "Of course," she replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I have to admit, I was curious." James nodded, his smile faltering just slightly as he settled back into his chair. "I suppose I was vague on the phone," he said, pushing a steaming mug of coffee across the table toward her. I wasn't sure how to explain it all at once. Claire took the mug gratefully, warming her hands around it. Well, I'm here now. What's on your mind, Mr. Whitmore? James, he corrected softly. Please, call me James. Claire nodded, offering a small smile. Okay, James. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his expression thoughtful. When I first saw you with Henry at the hospital, I thought it was unusual, he began. I've spent enough time in hospitals to know that most people don't take the time to care the way you do, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. Claire raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to say. I was just doing my job, she said carefully. James shook his head, his voice steady but firm. No, it was more than that. You saw him. You took the time to see Henry as a person, not just a patient. That's rare, Claire, and it made me realize how much I've overlooked in my own life. Claire shifted slightly in her seat, still unsure of where this was going. What do you mean? James exhaled, leaning back as he studied the dark liquid in his cup. For years, I've measured my success by numbers, profits, deals, acquisitions. But what does any of it mean if I'm not actually doing something that matters? Seeing you with Henry made me question that. He paused, his gaze steady as he looked back at her. I want to do something more, Claire. Something real. And I think you can help me. Claire blinked, taken aback. Me? How? James smiled faintly, as if anticipating her confusion. I want to create a program. A foundation, maybe. Something that focuses on helping seniors like Henry, people who are alone, forgotten, or struggling. But not just them. Nurses, too. Claire frowned slightly, leaning forward now. Nurses? Yes, James said firmly. You're overworked, underpaid, and stretched too thin. I've seen it. You're expected to do so much with so little. People like you are the backbone of hospitals, and yet no one seems to care about the sacrifices you make. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she listened, the weight of his words sinking in. I mean, you're not wrong, she admitted quietly. But what would you even do? What kind of program are you talking about? James's eyes brightened slightly, as though he had been waiting for that question. A foundation that provides resources, he explained. Support for nurses, grants for education, workshops for better care techniques, and maybe even funding for facilities where seniors like Henry can live with dignity and comfort. Claire stared at him, stunned. The idea felt too big, too impossible. You want to do all of that? James nodded. Yes, and I want you to be a part of it. Claire let out a small laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. Me? I'm just a nurse, James. I don't know anything about running foundations or programs. That's not true, James replied, his tone steady. You know exactly what people like Henry need. You've lived it. You see what others miss, and you care when no one else does. That's what matters. Claire opened her mouth to argue, but James held up a hand. I'm not asking you to do this alone, he said. I'll fund the foundation, and I'll handle the logistics. But I need someone with a heart for this kind of work. Someone who can guide the vision, someone like you. For a long moment, Claire was silent. She stared at her coffee, her mind racing. This wasn't the kind of conversation she had ever imagined herself having. She had spent her entire career focused on the next shift, the next patient, the next paycheck. She had never dared to think beyond that. James, she said finally, her voice quiet. This is a lot. It's an incredible idea, but I don't know if I'm the right person. James smiled faintly. I think you are. Claire met his gaze, searching for any sign that he might be insincere, but she found nothing but conviction. He truly meant what he was saying. Just think about it, James said gently. That's all I'm asking. Think about what we could do together. How many lives we could change. Claire nodded slowly, her thoughts still tangled. Okay, I'll think about it. That night, Claire sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, staring at James's business card lying on the coffee table. She had never been one to dream big. Growing up, her family had lived paycheck to paycheck, and Claire had learned early on to set her expectations low. Becoming a nurse had been the biggest dream she allowed herself, and even that had felt like a long shot. But now, here was James Whitmore, a man with money, influence, and ambition, asking her to be a part of something bigger than she had ever imagined. Someone who can guide the vision. Someone like you. Claire shook her head, her fingers brushing over the edges of the card. "What do I know about starting foundations?" she muttered to herself. And yet, she thought of Henry, sitting in his new room surrounded by books, his voice stronger every time she checked on him. She thought of the dozens of other patients she had seen over the years, so many of whom slipped through the cracks because no one had the time or resources to do more. She thought of her fellow nurses, bone-tired and stretched thin, running on nothing but caffeine and determination because the world relied on them but rarely gave them the support they needed. Claire leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The idea terrified her, but somewhere deep in her chest, a small flicker of hope began to burn. "What if I could do something more?" she whispered. The next day, Claire arrived at the hospital early, feeling a little more alert than usual despite her restless night. As she passed through the hallway near room 412, she couldn't help but pause and look in. The bed was empty now, freshly made with crisp sheets. Henry's absence was still new, and the room seemed quieter without him. But Claire smiled faintly as she imagined him sitting by the window of his new room, his favorite book in hand. "You deserve this, Henry," she murmured to herself before continuing down the hall. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to see a text message from James. "Whenever you're ready to talk, I'll be here." Claire slipped the phone back into her pocket, her steps a little lighter. She wasn't sure what she was going to do yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like there was something ahead of her, something worth reaching for. A week passed before Claire Reyes found herself standing outside a tall glass office building in the heart of the city. The morning chill clung to her skin as she adjusted her scarf and stared at the revolving doors, her nerves buzzing with uncertainty. She hadn't told anyone about this meeting, not Karen, not her co-workers, and certainly not Henry. Somehow saying it out loud would have made it feel real before she was ready for that. But here she was, clutching her bag tightly as she took a deep breath and pushed through the heavy glass doors. Inside, the lobby was sleek and modern, the faint smell of fresh coffee in the air. People in sharp suits moved with purpose, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors. Claire felt out of place in her simple navy sweater and modest slacks, but she kept her head high as she approached the receptionist. "Claire Reyes," she said softly, "I'm here to see Mr. Whitmore." The woman behind the desk nodded, typing something into her computer before looking up with a practiced smile. "Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. Take the elevator to the top floor." "Thank you," Claire replied, her voice steadier than she felt. As the elevator rose smoothly to the top floor, Claire's reflection stared back at her in the mirrored walls. She thought of all the patients she had cared for over the years, faces that had blurred together in moments of exhaustion but remained etched into her heart. She thought of Henry, sitting in his garden, his cane resting at his side as he turned the pages of Mice and Men. "Maybe it's not about what I know," she told herself quietly. "Maybe it's about what I've seen." When the elevator doors opened, Claire stepped into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. The sunlight poured in, bathing everything in a soft, golden glow. James Whitmore was standing near the window, his hands in his pockets as he stared out at the view. He turned when he heard her steps, a warm smile crossing his face. "Claire," he said, moving toward her and extending a hand. "I'm glad you came." Claire shook his hand, feeling her nerves ease slightly at his calm demeanor. "I almost didn't," she admitted with a faint smile, but I figured I'd at least hear you out." James gestured toward a small seating area where 2 chairs and a coffee table waited. "Fair enough. Please, have a seat." Claire sat down, smoothing her hands over her lap as James took the chair across from her. Between them, the table held a notepad and 2 cups of coffee. "I'm not going to overwhelm you with details right away," James began, his voice steady but sincere. "But I want you to understand what I'm envisioning and why I think you're the person who can help bring it to life." Claire nodded, meeting his gaze. "I'm listening." James leaned forward slightly, his tone thoughtful. "The foundation will have 2 core goals. First, to help seniors, people like Henry, who are often left behind. I want to provide housing, care, and companionship for those who need it most. Not sterile facilities or charity cases, but real communities where they feel valued." Claire nodded slowly, the words sinking in. "And the second goal?" James's expression softened. "The second is to support nurses like you. I've seen firsthand how much you give to your patients. You work tirelessly, often without enough resources, recognition, or support. It's not right." Claire stared at him, her chest tightening. "That's true," she admitted quietly. "There are days when it feels impossible to keep up. We all do our best, but—" She hesitated, trying to find the words. "Sometimes it's not enough." "That's what I want to change," James said firmly. "I want to create programs that offer nurses scholarships for continuing education, workshops for skills and leadership, and even grants to help improve care for patients. We'll start small, but with time, we can grow." Claire sat back, her thoughts spinning. It was ambitious, more ambitious than anything she had ever imagined being part of. And yet, James spoke with such clarity and purpose that she found herself leaning in, wanting to believe it could work. "Why me?" she asked after a moment. "You could hire people with more experience, people who've built programs like this before." James smiled faintly. "Because experience doesn't mean anything without heart. I've met people with all the right credentials, but no understanding of what it really means to care for others. You have that understanding, Claire. You see people, their struggles, their worth when others don't." Claire felt her throat tighten at his words, but she managed a small smile. "You make it sound like I'm something special." "You are," James said simply. For a moment, Claire was silent, staring down at the cup of coffee in her hands. She thought about the long hours at the hospital, the patients like Henry who slipped through the cracks because no one had the time to stop and help. She thought about her late father and how different his final days might have been if someone like James had reached out to her family. Finally, she looked up, her voice quiet but steady. "Okay," she said. "I'll help you, but I don't want this to be about me. I want it to be about the people we're helping: nurses, seniors, families. They're the ones who matter." James smiled, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Agreed." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. James moved quickly, securing office space in a modest building near the hospital and beginning the process of registering the foundation. Claire was hesitant at first, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar world of meetings, paperwork, and strategy sessions, but James stayed by her side, guiding her through each step with the same calm determination that had brought her here. Claire split her time between the hospital and the foundation, working long hours, but feeling a new sense of purpose that carried her through even the most exhausting days. She began reaching out to local nurses and community leaders, gathering stories and insights to help shape the programs they would offer. One afternoon, as Claire sat at her desk in the small office surrounded by stacks of notes and books, her phone buzzed with a familiar name. "Henry Blake," the screen read. Claire's face lit up as she answered. "Henry, how are you?" "Still alive," Henry said dryly, though Claire could hear the smile in his voice. "I thought I'd call and check on you, see if you've forgotten about an old man like me." "Never," Claire replied, laughing softly. "I've been busy, but I've been thinking about you. How's the garden?" Henry sighed contentedly. "Peaceful. I sat out there this morning and started reading To Kill a Mockingbird again. I thought of you." "I'm glad," Claire said softly, her voice warm. "You deserve peaceful days, Henry." There was a pause on the other end, and then Henry spoke again, his tone more serious. "You know, Claire, you gave me something I didn't think I'd get back. Hope. Don't ever forget what that's worth." Claire blinked back the sudden sting of tears. "Thank you, Henry," she said quietly. "That means a lot." That evening, Claire sat on the small balcony of her apartment, the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. She thought about how much had changed in just a few short months. Henry had found peace and comfort. James had found purpose beyond business and wealth. And she, well, she was still learning what her role in all this would become. But as she sat there, listening to the hum of the city below, one thought echoed through her mind. Kindness doesn't just change one life. It ripples outward, touching everyone it reaches. She had seen it firsthand, and she knew the ripples were only just beginning. 3 months later, the modest office Claire Reyes had once walked into with uncertainty was alive with quiet purpose. The small team at the foundation, only a handful of volunteers and staff, bustled through the rooms, organizing paperwork, making calls, and putting together the final details for their first major event. It was a gathering that would bring together seniors, nurses, and members of the community, a celebration of what had been accomplished so far and a promise of what was still to come. Claire stood by a table, carefully sorting through care packages, bags filled with tea, books, hand-knitted blankets, and simple treats. The foundation, now named the Heart's Hands Foundation, had started small but grown quickly. With James Whitmore's backing and Claire's vision, they had been able to distribute care kits to isolated seniors, offer free workshops for nurses, and even start building partnerships with hospitals and community centers. "Claire, these are ready for the welcome table," called Lisa, one of the volunteers. Claire looked up and smiled gratefully. "Thank you, Lisa. They look perfect," Lisa grinned. "You're a tough boss, you know, but I like working for you." Claire chuckled softly, shaking her head. "I'm not your boss, just someone figuring things out as we go." "You're a leader, Claire," Lisa said warmly, before heading off with the bags. Claire stood still for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the windows where the afternoon sun poured golden light into the room. She had never imagined herself as a leader, never dreamed she would be part of something like this. Yet here she was, standing in the middle of a growing movement she had helped inspire. Outside the building, James Whitmore stepped out of his car, straightening his jacket as he looked up at the modest office sign that read, Heart's Hands Foundation. He had attended countless corporate events in buildings far grander than this, but as he entered the small, bustling space, something about it felt real, in a way nothing else ever had. Claire noticed him as soon as he walked in, and she gave a small wave from across the room. "James," she called, walking toward him. "You made it." "I wouldn't miss it," James replied with a smile. "How's everything coming together?" "Almost ready," Claire said, her voice tinged with nervous excitement. "We've got seniors from the local care facilities coming, a few nurses from the hospital, and some people from the community. It's small, but it's exactly what it needs to be," James finished for her. Claire looked up at him, surprised, and then smiled. "Thank you for everything. None of this would have happened without you." James shook his head. "No, Claire. This happened because of you. I just gave it a push." Claire opened her mouth to protest, but before she could respond, a familiar voice called her name. "Claire!" She turned, her face lighting up as she saw Henry Blake, standing by the doorway with the help of his cane. He wore a clean, pressed coat and a soft wool hat, his cheeks slightly flushed from the cold. By his side was Mrs. Turner, the director of the senior care facility, her hand gently resting on his arm. "Henry!" Claire exclaimed, rushing to greet him. "You made it!" Henry smiled warmly, his grip firm as he took her hand. "Of course I did," he said. "I wouldn't miss this for the world." "You look wonderful," Claire said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. Henry chuckled softly, glancing around the room. "This place looks pretty wonderful, too. You've been busy, Claire." Claire blushed, glancing toward James, who had followed her over. "I've had a lot of help," she admitted. Henry looked up at James, studying him for a moment before nodding. "So you're the one who stepped in," he said. James extended his hand, smiling. "James Whitmore. It's nice to meet you, Henry." Henry shook his hand firmly, his eyes twinkling. "You're a good man for helping make this happen. But don't let Claire fool you. She's the heart of all this." James glanced at Claire, smiling softly. "I know," he said. The gathering began as the late afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon. Seniors from nearby care homes sat at round tables draped in soft linen, sipping tea and chatting quietly as volunteers brought out small plates of sandwiches and cookies. Nurses from St. Clair's Hospital trickled in after their shifts, their scrubs wrinkled, but their smiles genuine as they sat down beside their patients and community members. Henry sat at a table near the window, a warm blanket draped over his lap, as he chatted with a group of older men and women. At one point, Claire saw him holding up a small book from his care package, proudly sharing his love for Steinbeck with anyone who would listen. The sight made her heart swell. Near the front of the room, James stepped up to the small podium that had been set up. He tapped the microphone lightly to get everyone's attention, and the hum of conversation quieted. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice carrying across the room. "Thank you all for coming today. This gathering may seem small, but it's a big step toward something important." He paused, glancing toward Claire, who stood by the side of the room, watching intently. "When I first met Claire Reyes," he continued, "I didn't understand what it meant to truly see someone, to care about someone beyond the surface. But Claire showed me that small moments of kindness can change everything, not just for the person receiving them, but for everyone around them." Claire felt her cheeks flush as eyes turned toward her, but James's words settled gently into her heart. "This foundation is a reflection of that kindness," James said. "It's here to make sure no one feels forgotten, no one feels overlooked. Seniors who deserve dignity and joy, nurses who deserve support and recognition. It's just the beginning, but I believe this can grow into something truly special." The room erupted in quiet applause, and James stepped back, gesturing toward Claire. "And none of it would have happened without Claire Reyes." Claire froze as people turned to her expectantly, but Henry's voice broke the silence. "Come on, Claire," he said, grinning. "Say something!" Laughter rippled through the room, and Claire let out a breath, smiling as she walked to the podium. Her hands gripped the edges nervously, but when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "I'm not used to being in front of crowds," she said, drawing a few chuckles. "But all of this, it's not about me. It's about all of you. It's about people like Henry, who remind us that every life matters. It's about my fellow nurses, who give so much of themselves every day. And it's about kindness, simple, quiet kindness that ripples out further than we ever realize." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "This is just the beginning, but I believe we can do something amazing here. Thank you all for being part of it." The room erupted in applause again, but Claire didn't feel overwhelmed. For the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the evening wound down, Claire sat beside Henry near the window, watching the fading light spill across the room. "You did good, Claire," Henry said softly. "Margaret would have liked you. You know, she would have seen what I see." Claire blinked back tears, smiling. "Thank you, Henry. That means the world." Henry patted her hand gently. "Keep going. People need you." Claire looked around the room at the nurses chatting with seniors, at James speaking quietly with a group of volunteers, at the small but meaningful connections forming everywhere she looked. Henry was right. This was just the beginning. As the last guests trickled out and the room grew quiet, Claire stood with James by the door, looking out into the night. "Do you ever think about how this all started?" James asked quietly. Claire smiled softly, nodding. "It started with Henry, and a cup of tea." "And you," James added, "because you cared enough to stay." Claire looked at him, the weight of those words settling deep within her. "Maybe that's all it takes," she said. "One moment of kindness." As they stood there in the glow of the streetlights, Claire felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. And for once, it didn't feel fragile or fleeting. It felt strong, steady, and real. Kindness could change the world, she realized, and now she was part of it. Months later, the Heart's Hands Foundation had become more than Claire Reyes ever dreamed possible. The small office now buzzed daily with volunteers, nurses, and community members who believed in its mission. They had expanded beyond care packages and workshops, organizing monthly gatherings for seniors, offering scholarships for aspiring nurses, and creating partnerships with hospitals across the city. Claire stood outside the foundation's office one crisp morning, watching a group of seniors arrive for their weekly book club meeting. Among them was Henry Blake, walking slowly but steadily with his cane, a worn copy of Mice and Men tucked under his arm. He caught Claire's eye and gave her a small, knowing smile. "Still keeping busy, I see," he called, his voice light with humor. Claire grinned. "I learned from the best, Henry." As Henry disappeared into the building, Claire turned and saw James Whitmore leaning against his car, watching the scene unfold. He smiled as he approached her. "You've built something amazing here," he said softly. Claire shook her head with a modest smile. "We built it." James nodded, looking out toward the bustling street. "And it's only just beginning." Claire knew he was right. The foundation was more than just programs and events. It was a promise to keep the ripples of kindness spreading, to reach more people, and to remind the world that no one should be forgotten. As she looked toward the horizon, she couldn't help but think back to that evening at the hospital when it all began: a single cup of tea, a conversation with Henry, and a decision to stay. That small moment had grown into something far bigger than herself, and it reminded her of a simple truth: kindness, no matter how small, could change lives. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of compassion, hope, and the power of human connection. If this story touched you, consider spreading kindness in your own way. Sometimes, the smallest gesture can make the biggest difference. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. It's your support that helps bring more stories like this to life, stories of resilience, kindness, and hope that inspire us all. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Let's keep the ripples of kindness moving forward together.